The great starship drifted silently through the silver belt of asteroids that shimmered like dust in space, and inside the grand hall of the alien vessel, there was a ceremony taking place with lights glowing softly across the polished black walls, and guards standing still like stone as diplomats from both worlds gathered near the center where two cultures were about to meet for the first time in peace and purpose. The humans arrived in a smooth silver transport that docked beside the main corridor, and among them walked Leo, a young officer with a casual way of carrying himself, always easygoing, never too formal, and mostly curious about everything around him, especially alien customs which he barely studied because he believed in real conversation more than rule books. Leo's boots tapped lightly on the floor as he stepped into the hall, looking up at the towering ceiling, then around at the strange but beautiful decorations made of glowing blue threads that floated gently in midair like they were alive and responding to breath itself. And as his eyes swept the room, he saw her standing at the end of the long path with her advisors all around her, the princess of their empire, tall, graceful, dressed in elegant layered robes that shifted color like flowing water underlie. Her name was Mira, and her expression was unreadable at first, with golden eyes that seemed both sharp and distant, like she was watching not just the room, but what it meant and what it could become. And as Leo approached, he could feel the tension in the air, the kind of silent pressure that comes when no one knows what might happen if someone says the wrong thing. Lead diplomat from Earth offered the usual greetings, respectful, calm. Practice, then Mira replied in the formal tone of her people, with slow poetic rhythm that echoed gently through the chamber. And for a while everything went smooth like a dance that had been rehearsed 100 times. But then it was Leo's turn to step forward as representative of the human delegation for informal cultural bonding, and as he did, he noticed Mira watching him closely. He smiled without thinking, and something in him ignored the official script completely. Instead, he tilted his head just a bit and said with a grin on his face, "Well, hello there, Cutie." There was a pause, a long one, like time stopped moving. The room fell into a deep silence, so complete it almost felt heavy, and Mira froze, her posture perfect, yet something about her face shifted slowly. Her cheeks began to change color from pale silver to a soft pink, then deeper into a glowing rose hue, like liquid blush spreading across her skin. The guards looked at each other, the advisors blinked, the Earth delegates stood unsure of what just happened, and Leo blinked too, not fully realizing what he had done, until he noticed Mira covering her mouth gently with one hand as if to hide the way. Her lips were pulling into something close to a smile. It was not just shock, it was fascination, a reaction no one expected, not even her, and the blush did not fade. Instead, it spread like soft flame beneath her eyes and along the curve of her neck, a glow that was clearly visible, even through the shimmer of her royal garments. Mira quickly turned away, her voice slightly uneven, as she ordered the formal gathering to proceed, and Leo was gently escorted to the side while whispers began to flow through both groups. Neither hostile nor alarmed, but deeply curious and confused about what they had just seen. Leo sat near the observation window later that evening, thinking about what he had said, trying to understand why it caused such a powerful reaction. He had meant it playfully, just a human thing, something kind and silly, but clearly in their culture words like that must have a deeper or more intimate meaning. Maybe no one ever spoke to her like that. Maybe no one ever saw her as a person rather than a symbol. Meanwhile, in her private chambers, Mira sat still, breathing slowly, her hand resting near her cheek where the warmth still lingered, and she stared into the polished reflection of the glass wall where she could see the faint blush that refused to fade away, and she whispered the word he had used, trying to understand its shape and sound. Cutie. It meant something soft, something innocent, yet full of strange weight when spoken by that human, and though she had heard many titles, many honors, nothing ever made her heart beat like this. She did not know why she wanted to hear it again. Her aides came in quietly to ask if she was unwell, but she waved them off, saying nothing, just staring out at the stars, thinking of the way Leo smiled, not as a man who wanted something, but as someone who saw her not as a ruler, not as a creature of command, but simply as a girl standing there among diplomats in duty. And somewhere far inside her, a feeling began to grow, a spark from a single word, a moment of true surprise, and something told her that this human had done something no ambassador or warrior ever managed to do. He broke through the mask and reached the part of her that had long been asleep. Outside the window, the stars kept moving, the ship kept drifting, and across the quiet hallways of the alien flagship, the memory of the word echoed again and again in her mind: Cutie. The following day, the starship remained in its orbit, a silent colossus in the cold blackness of space, with its glowing panels casting soft light across endless corridors. And while the halls were still and quiet, behind closed doors, something unusual was unfolding, something no protocol had ever prepared the crew for, and no diplomatic scroll had ever written about, because it was never expected that one word could cause such a reaction, not even among species that had spent decades learning how to understand each other. Mira, the princess of the great empire, sat before a large mirror in her chamber, her eyes fixed on the subtle colors still clinging to her cheeks, and though she had bathed in cooling light and consumed herbal restoratives meant to still the body and calm the blood, the color remained stubborn, and her thoughts refused to settle. Each time she tried to meditate, her mind would drift back to the moment his voice touched the air, when the strange word passed through his lips, so easily, without permission or ritual. Cutie. She whispered it again, not out loud, but within, where thoughts were softer and more real than sound, and her hands folded together as if holding something fragile, because no one had ever spoken to her that way before, and certainly not in public, never with such simplicity and warmth. And something more she could not quite name, but it made her feel like a part of her had been seen, not the princess, not the symbol, not the chosen daughter of the throne, but something smaller and truer, something lost in layers of duty. Across the ship, Leo wandered through the shared quarters assigned to Earth's delegates, unsure whether to laugh or apologize, or both. And though the other diplomats were too nervous to scold him directly, he could feel the weight of their concern. Every time someone glanced his way, he heard words like disrespect and unintentional offense and diplomatic breach, but all Leo could think about was her face, not in a romantic way, not yet, but in the kind of way that made him wonder if he had just shattered some ancient invisible wall. He wanted to fix it, even though he wasn't sure it was broken. He began asking the assistant AI for help, searching through their cultural records, studying their art and songs, their customs and courtship traditions, and after several hours of reading, he found a pattern in their history that fascinated him. It seemed their people rarely used words for affection in casual ways, and that emotional expressions were deeply private, reserved only for the closest bonds, and in many cases never spoken aloud at all. He realized then that what he had said might have felt like an emotional burst, not a joke, and that maybe his smile had opened a door that had been closed for generations. He didn't want to make her uncomfortable, but he also didn't want to leave that moment hanging in silence. So Leo took a chance and asked one of the ship's guides to help him find something from Earth, something small and gentle, something that did not belong to war or trade or power, but to meaning and thought. And after searching through the diplomatic archive, they found a preserved seed case, an earth flower stored in stasis for cultural gift exchange. It was a forget-me-not, simple blue petals with a name that told a story all on its own. He placed it inside a transparent cube, then wrote a message, not with fancy words or earth poetry, but just a sentence in plain text. I hope this reminds you that smiles are meant to be shared, and he left it outside her chamber door before returning to his bunk, where he lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, wondering whether he would ever hear from her again. Inside her chamber, Mira stood motionless as her handmaiden brought the message and gift. She took the cube and looked at the tiny flower suspended in stasis, its color soft and clear against the crystal, and when she read the message, Her cheeks warmed again, and her fingers trembled just a little, not from fear, but from something new. She placed the gift on her desk and sat beside it for hours, doing nothing but watching the petals float in their sealed case. She traced the edges with her fingertip, not touching, only feeling, and she read the message again, then again, as if trying to understand how a human could carry such kindness in such few words, and how something so small could make her chest feel strange, like her breath had been caught in a memory she never lived. Royal Science Team was soon alerted to her condition, though she had no illness, and the glow in her face was declared a harmless yet curious side effect, possibly emotional in origin, and they began quiet observation without interrupting her routine. Mira said nothing to them, only nodded and allowed the scans to proceed, though inwardly she ignored all of it because she already knew the cause, and she had no intention of hiding from it. Something inside her had changed. Requested a meeting with the human again, not in ceremony, not in public, just a simple shared moment in the quiet part of the ship where the artificial garden grew, and though her advisors advised against it, she waved them away with a calm hand, and said that learning was part of diplomacy, and that understanding emotion was as important as understanding language. When Leo received the message, he almost dropped his food tray, and ran straight to the garden early, and waited under the glass dome where soft blue vines curled across the walls, and artificial birds whispered songs from hidden speakers, and he stood there, wondering whether she would even look at him or whether she would ask for apology in front of guards. But when she arrived, she was alone, and she walked with a quiet grace, not like a princess, but like someone choosing to be just herself. She stood before him and did not speak at first, just looked at him as if deciding whether he was real or just a strange figure from a forgotten dream. Then she pointed at the flower cube in his hand and said softly, "This is beautiful." Then she added, "Thank you," and her voice held something unfamiliar, like warmth wrapped in tradition. And when Leo smiled and said, "Glad you like it," her face turned pink again, and he could see her lips curve ever so slightly, not with command, not with confidence, but with something honest. And for a while they stood there in silence, not awkward, not forced, just present and still, like two minds learning how to seethe. Garden became their quiet meeting place, far away from duty and distant from the weight of expectations. It was the only place on the ship where time felt soft, where the artificial sunlight mixed with the scent of alien moss and earth flowers, creating a space that felt untouched by rules or titles. And Mira began visiting more often, always at times when the hallways were silent and the guards remained unaware of her gentle departures. Leo never asked why she came. He only welcomed her with that same relaxed smile and calm voice, and soon their moments were filled with conversation, not the kind filled with politics or questions of trade, but with stories, simple human stories that made her blink and tilt her head, as if she were discovering a forgotten part of the universe. She listened with stillness as he described earth rain and how people danced under it, how children made snow angels and threw frozen powder into the air, just for fun. She watched his hands move as he explained, laughter, not the laughter she had seen in formal events, but the kind that made your stomach ache and your eyes water. And when he made her repeat funny words like banana and yikes and oops, she tried to stay composed, but each time something inside her bubbled, and the glow on her cheeks would return. Mira found herself waiting for those words, the silly ones, the strange ones, the words that held no clear meaning in her culture, yet seemed to carry warmth, like hidden fire, and she wrote them down later in a small private notebook. Words no one knew. She had words like cute and hug and dork and cutie. The science team continued to monitor her emotional waves with quiet confusion as their sensors picked up frequent spikes in heat and blood flow. Though she showed no signs of distress, they could not explain the pattern, but Mira never explained and never answered their inquiries. Instead, she increased her hours in the diplomatic reading chamber, where Leo happened to spend most of his afternoons. One day, as they walked along the edge of the glowing lake within the garden, Mira stopped and asked, Why humans used soft names for others, names that seemed small and silly, yet made people smile, and Leo looked at her for a moment, then answered that sometimes humans like to make others feel special, not with status or glory, but with small reminders that they were seen and liked and cherished in quiet ways. She did not respond right away. Instead, she stared at her reflection in the still water, watching the way the light touched her skin, and for a moment, she did not look like a royal. She looked like someone trying to remember what it meant to feel something without permission. The connection grew, and word began to spread. Quietly among the lower ranks, whispers of the human who made the princess glow, and the princess who kept breaking tradition to meet with a man who had no title, but held her attention like no one else ever had. Her advisors noticed the change too, though they said little at first, hoping it would pass like a phase. But Mira began asking questions in court. She asked about Earth traditions, about art and laughter and free will, and whether emotional openness weakened a ruler or made them more alive. And when she smiled during the trade agreement discussion, the elders grew worried, for they had never seen the royal face crack with softness, not in all her years of service, not since she was trained to carry the weight of the empire. Leo remained unaware of the stir he caused, and perhaps that was why Myra liked him even more, because he spoke without calculation and moved without careful pause. He offered things without knowing their impact and gave moments without asking for return, and to her that was a kind of power more rare than any political strategy. One evening, while the garden shimmered under soft twilight and stars moved slowly behind the glass dome, Mira brought a small music sphere from her private collection and placed it between them. She told him it was an old song from her childhood, played during times of transition and growth. And when the music started, Leo listened and understood that, even without knowing the language, the feeling inside the melody was full of change. They sat in silence, listening to the notes float like air, and Mira closed her eyes for a moment and whispered that she no longer felt certain of her place, not because she disliked her path, but because for the first time she wondered if there was more to life than duty and silence. And Leo did not answer her with words. Instead, he gently placed the forget-me-not flower cube between them and said that maybe the universe made room for small things because they mattered to her. Eyes met his, and in that moment, no one spoke and no one needed to, because something real had grown between them, something that was never planned, never permitted, but deeply true. When the song ended, Mira remained still, then looked at Leo and asked him to say it again, the word he first used that day, and though he hesitated, wondering if it was right, he saw her face full of light and quiet hope, and he spoke gently, calling her Cutie once more. The glow returned stronger than ever, and this time she did not hide it. Outside the garden, the world remained uncertain, and their connection unknown to most. But within that space where stars watched quietly from above and flowers from Earth and another world shared the same soil, something rare had begun, a bond that defied borders, a friendship that bloomed from kindness and curiosity, and one single word that carried more truth than any title ever could. Whispers moved faster than sound across the metal walls of the great vessel, and where once the garden had been a quiet, secret place of small smiles and new emotions, it had now become a subject of quiet concern among those who walked the upper halls in polished robes and silver badges. The royal advisors had begun to speak in circles behind closed doors, and the High Council of the Empire watched the records with steady eyes that missed nothing, and though no one dared speak her name with judgment, the truth hung in the air like static waiting to spark. Mira noticed the change not in the words spoken to her, but in the way others moved around her, the way guards shifted in their stance, the way assistants lowered their gaze when they handed her new reports, and the way silence stretched longer during council meetings, as if her presence stirred something unspoken among them all. And yet she said nothing. She only carried herself with grace, even as her thoughts swirled heavier each day. For the garden no longer felt like escape, it felt like a line she had crossed, and now there was no way to return to who she had been before. Leo sensed it too, though no one told him directly. He felt it in the way the ship's AI delayed his access requests to certain sectors, in the way the food staff no longer made light conversation, and in the way the hallway lights dimmed faster when he passed through, as if the ship itself had begun pulling away from him. And when he asked his own delegation what was going on, they told him gently but clearly that his friendship with the alien princes had reached the ears of those who saw peace as something fragile and not meant to be touched by emotions. They warned him not to make further contact, not because they doubted his intentions, but because politics was a house of mirrors, and one wrong look could shatter more than just his career. It could unravel an entire treaty. He listened, but his heart refused to agree for all he had ever shown. Mira was kindness and truth, and in his mind those were not crimes. They were the start of real peace. Mira sat before her window in silence that night, looking out at the stars, and wondering when honesty became a danger, and when did warmth become something to be hidden. And her fingers touched the notebook, where she had written every word Leo had ever taught her, every soft phrase and silly joke, every human idiom that made her chest flutter like a winged creature, trying to break free from years of stillness. And though she tried to be calm, her pulse betrayed her. The following day the council summoned her to a formal gathering, a room lined with ancient symbols and cold light, where the most powerful voices of her world sat behind glass walls, speaking not with anger but with controlled fear. They asked her questions masked as guidance. They reminded her of the weight of her position, of the generations who had sacrificed emotion in service of order, and of the balance that must be kept when dealing with species that thrived on chaos and feeling. She listened without speaking until they asked her directly if she had been compromised, and whether her judgment had been swayed by the human. And that was when something inside her snapped, not with rage, but with clarity. She stood slowly, her hands steady, her eyes bright, not from defiance, but from truth. And she told them that for too long their kind had confused silence with strength, and that they had mistaken control for wisdom, and that if peace could not allow room for laughter or light, then it was not peace at all. They stared without reaction. But something shifted in the room. She left without waiting for their reply, and walked straight to the human quarters, her steps quiet but certain. And when the guards at the door tried to question her, she looked at them once and they moved aside. Leo looked up as she entered, and before he could speak, she crossed the room and placed the flower cube gently on the table between them, then sat across from him and asked if he remembered the first time he gave it to her. He nodded slowly and waited. She told him about the council and the questions and the warnings, and then she looked into his eyes and said that she had never asked to feel what she felt, but now that she had, she would not run from it, and she would not apologize for it. And if her people saw that as weakness, then perhaps they had forgotten what it meant to be truly strong. Leo reached across the table and took her hand, not with ceremony or hesitation, but with the simple care that had started it all. And in that moment, she knew that this was not a mistake. This was a beginning. Word of her visit spread quickly, and though some tried to spin it as rebellion, others began to wonder if perhaps emotion was not the enemy of reason, but its partner. And within days, new debates began within the empire about tradition and change, about duty and desire, and about whether one human word could carry enough power to shift the future of an entire alliance. And in the center of that storm stood Mira, still and calm, with a flower in her hand and a truth in her heart that could no longer be silenced. Days that followed were filled with quiet waiting across both ships, while the human delegation remained cautious. The alien empire held its breath for the decision of the High Council had not yet been spoken, and everyone knew the choice would echo through the alliance halls for years to come. And even though there was no war, no blood, no weapons raised, the tension was heavier than any battlefield, because the question was not about territory or trade, but about hearts and what could be allowed to grow between two different worlds when rules were Built to keep them apart, Mira did not hide anymore. She walked the corridors without escort, nodded gently at those who stared, and gave no apology for the warmth in her face when her thoughts wandered back to the one human who changed everything with a smile and a single word. She stood in gardens and met with curious minds and answered questions without shame, telling them that she had not been taken or swayed, but awakened by kindness, and that if her people feared the strength of feeling, then they had never understood power at all. Leo remained quiet most of the time, speaking only when spoken to, watching the way the crew around him adjusted to the slow shift in atmosphere, and though he still did not know what would happen, he trusted her, not because she promised peace, but because every action she took was built on honesty, and that was a rare thing. In diplomacy, he thought it was rare, even on Earth. Then the day arrived when the High Council summoned both delegations to the Central Chamber, a place built for witness and judgment, where generations had once gathered to hear the words that shaped law and future. And as Mira walked beside Leo, with her expression calm and her step steady, there was no fear in her eyes, only purpose, and Leo matched her pace, not as a soldier, not as a diplomat, but simply as someone who believed in what she was fighting for. The chamber was vast and cold, with layered rings of officials above and a clear circle below, where Mira and Leo stood at the center while the voices of the elders echoed from above. They asked no questions, they only spoke of legacy and unity, of risk and reputation, of the long road it took to reach this fragile peace. And then came the final statement, spoken without emotion but filled with meaning. The council would not break the alliance, they would not remove Mira from her role, they would allow her to continue her diplomatic path with the understanding that her personal choices would no longer be governed by the Empire, as long as her decisions served the interest of peace and balance. No one clapped, no one cheered, but something deep and silent shifted across both sides, and for the first time Mira saw eyes soften in the crowd, and Leo felt the heavy grip of uncertainty begin to ease. Later, as the chamber emptied and the cold lights dimmed, Mira stood alone with Leo near the garden gate where they had first spoken, without guards, without audience, just the two of them standing beneath the glass sky, where stars moved slowly above and the petals of earth flowers swayed gently under artificial wind. She held the same cube in her hands, the one with the small blue flower still alive, still floating in its stasis bubble, and she looked at it for a long moment before she spoke, telling him that even now she did not fully understand what had happened between them, but that whatever it was, it had become part of her and would remain with her always. Leo smiled and replied that he never planned any of it, that all he ever did was speak like he would to anyone he cared about, and maybe that was the point. Maybe what made it real was how simple it all began, just a greeting, a word, a glance. She stepped closer, and for the first time, her fingers brushed his without hesitation, her skin warm, her glow returning not out of embarrassment, but from peace and quiet joy. And then she said softly that she wanted to hear it again, the word, the one that started it all, because it made her feel like she was more than her crown and title, and more than the bloodlines that carved her path. And Leo leaned in just a little and whispered it again, not loud, not bold, just gentle and true. Cutie. And when he said it, her eyes closed for a second as if the sound itself touched her core, and when she opened them again, the blush was brighter than ever. And this time it stayed. They walked the garden paths for a long while that evening, saying little but understanding much. And when they paused beneath the tall silver tree that grew in the center of the garden, she placed the flower cube on the ground beside its roots as a mark of something new. Later, the reports were written, the official language carefully crafted to describe the events as mutual cultural development and emotional diplomacy, but those who were there would never forget what they saw in the faces of a princess and a human who never meant to change the course of an empire with a single word, yet somehow did. And in quiet corners of both worlds, stories would be told about the day as simple earthward passed through space and reached the heart of a distant princess. Stories not of war or conquest, but of warmth and wonder, and how something small carried across a gap wider Then galaxies became the start of something no law could ever truly define, and though they parted ways for a time as duties called them back to their own planets, neither forgot, and neither lost what had begun in that garden. For words once spoken with care never truly vanish. They echo where they matter most, in memory and meaning, in moments where hearts are finally allowed to speak the end.